Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming out this afternoon for our lecture from the Institute for Studies of Religion. I'm Dr. Tommy Kidd. I'm the Associate Director of the Institute and also a Professor of History here at Baylor. I'm glad to welcome you. If you don't know, the Institute for Studies of Religion is an interdisciplinary institute on campus that sponsors a range of lectures and programs on the study of religion across a number of disciplines, including philosophy and history and current events and politics, like our lecture today. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Brendan Miniter. He, as you may know and have seen from the flyer, is the Director of Historical Scholarship at the George W. Bush Presidential Center in Dallas. And he managed the development of the permanent exhibit for the Bush Center's Presidential Museum. And he currently oversees content development for special exhibits and historical projects. And previously, he was senior editorial director for the Bush Institute. Mr. Miniter is the co-author and editor of the 4% Solution, Unleashing the Economic Growth America Needs, which is a book containing chapters from 24 leading thinkers, including 5 Nobel laureates, and that was published in 2012. Before joining the Bush Institute, Mr. Miniter edited Mitch Daniels' best-selling book, Keeping the Republic, and also Karl Rove's best-selling autobiography, Courage and Consequences. And for almost 10 years, Mr. Miniter served as a writer and editor for the Wall Street Journal's editorial page. Mr. Miniter has provided on-air commentary for many news outlets, including Fox News, CNN, and CNBC. And his lecture today on a very timely topic is leadership, purpose, and national unity in times of crisis. Let's welcome Brendan Miniter.
Well, thank you very much. I always like coming to Waco. I always seem to do well when I come here. My first trip to Waco was actually on a date with the woman who did me the honor of saying yes when I asked her to marry me. We took a trip up from Austin to visit Texas Rangers Museum. My other forays through Waco had to do with President Bush. As you probably know, he has a ranch not that far outside of here, so I come through here to see him and sometimes meet with him. And we do something called the Warrior 100 every year. We take about 20 wounded warriors from the Iraq or Afghanistan and take them on a 100-kilometer mountain bike ride. We've been doing it now at the ranch, and so we stay here in Waco. So I have a lot of positive memories of being here. Every time I'm here, I seem to be treated really well. So when I had the chance to come down here, I was pretty excited and said, obviously, I'd love to do it. So, what I want to talk about today a little bit is, as you heard, a timely topic. But I'll start with this question: when was the last time you saw a professional sports franchise halt a game because the crowd was demanding to hear or see a speech being given by an elected official in Washington, D.C.? Well, that's exactly what happened on September 20th, 2001. You had the Philadelphia Flyers hockey team versus New York Rangers. And between the second and third period, the Jumbotron put on the TV, current news events, and they just happened to flip back over to the game when President Bush was stepping to the podium to give what has become known as a joint session speech to Congress. So the audience at first booed when they flipped back to the game and then started to chant, "Leave it on." So the officials wisely flipped back to the president, suspended play. And for 36 minutes, any thoughts of hockey, well, were put on ice. As a news account of the time put it, when the president was talking, the arena fell silent. I wanted to bring you back to that moment because I think it really illustrates how united of a country we were in just the weeks after 9/11, right? So the larger question is, given this amazing display of national unity, why did it happen? Now, the short answer is, okay, this is a national crisis, right? We come together in moments of crisis. But, we've come to believe that such unity in moments of crisis are automatic. And why not? There's many of times when, at a critical juncture, the country did come together. So my question is, why did it happen in this case? And more broadly, how is national unity achieved? The quick answer you've already formulated in your mind, but I'm going to hopefully break through it here a little bit to say it's not a given. Indeed, there are a lot of examples in our history when we didn't come together at a critical moment. Let's start where it began for the country, during the Revolution. A lot of you know stories about Valley Forge and George Washington's army living a desperate existence. One of the reasons that they had such a tough time is we had fractured leadership. We had a dysfunctional Congress that couldn't organize itself to feed or pay the army, right? There's plenty of other times in our history when we were fractured. The biggest being 1861, when President Lincoln was coming to power just at the start of the Civil War. A war that, of course, would leave hundreds of thousands of Americans dead on battlefields stretching from Pennsylvania all the way to here to Texas, right? Or in a house divided. A century after the Civil War, 1950s and 60s, we can point to several moments of civil unrest. So there's been a lot of moments in our history when we were not a united country. In fact, if you look at our history, I think that it's a story of factions duking it out, saying, here's who I think we should lead the country versus there. And a lot of these moments come at points of high stress. So, given that history, how is it possible that we do come together at critical moments? How have we achieved common purpose to go out and accomplish big things from, well, the easiest one to point to is winning wars. And by the way, war is itself something that places a tremendous amount of stress on the country and our political system. Democracies don't like to wage war, particularly for long periods of time. So, what I want to talk about today is a common thread I see running through our history that has led to our country being united when it needed to be. I want to look at moments when there's a critical mass of people who emerged, who stepped up, to quote William F. Buckley in a very different context, who stood athwart history yelling, "Stop," and actually were able to change the course of history. There are many common threads that we can look at through different periods, and you'll probably have a few that you want to point out. But what I want to highlight today is the one that I think is too often overlooked, and that's the connection between national unity and leadership that finds a purpose that is larger than ourselves. Now, that's a mouthful and it means a lot, so let's take just half a second here to think about what I mean. I'll break it into three pieces. First, the nation is rarely united, and when it seems united, it's often because one set of voices is muted for one reason or another. It doesn't feel comfortable speaking out. But there are moments when there's a large enough number of people who come to common purpose. Those are the ones I'm talking about. Second, let's consider what I mean by finding a purpose larger than ourselves. What does that mean? Here at ISR, there's a treasure trove of research. I had asked for some research that showed when someone finds a larger purpose in their life, what does it mean? And I got probably a box full of material pointing out different research that's been done here or looked at and aggregated here that showed what happens when people do find a larger purpose, and you can look at it. So when prisoners find a larger purpose coming out of prison, often that enables them to lead a more successful life after prison. And intuitively, we know why this would be the case, right? If you start looking at your own actions and saying there's a larger moral standard to be applied, you're probably going to live a more positive life. You're going to say, it's not about me, it's about a larger issue, right? So you start to act differently. Well, that's true for nations as well. Third, my third piece is not as intuitive, but it has to do with inspiring others, right? Now, I think I've used the term moral purpose here, and I've done it because I think that you will understand the context of it. But anytime you take the words moral purpose and put them next to political leadership, the conversation quickly shifts to trying to impose a moral view on people. And that's not what I mean. What I'm talking about is leaders who inspire the nation to stand together and follow what is often a difficult path. And they do so by identifying a larger issue at risk that everyone wants to see preserved. In other words, they found a larger moral issue that can inspire common purpose. Let me give you a couple of concrete examples. Go back to the Revolutionary War. Late in the war, the Army was contemplating marching on Congress. Probably not the last time someone had that impulse, right? This is the moment where historians have pointed to that Washington could have become king if he had so desired. And if you guys know a lot about this particular period in history, but we have something called the Newburgh Conspiracy. That's because that's where the Army was based, in Newburgh, New York, and they had this idea to march on Washington, march on Congress, demand their pay, potentially unseat Congress, and Washington got wind of this. So he crushed it. He shows up to the meeting, surprises everybody, walks to the front of the room, pauses, pulls out a pair of his eyeglasses, and I'll read you the quote. He goes, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles. For I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." Different historians will have noted that at this moment, the room of soldiers didn't hear the rest of the remarks he had to say. Tears were just running down their face because they were remembering all the different moments they had fought, throughout the campaigns they had fought. And they started to realize that what they were about to throw away, and this was Washington's point, was everything they had fought for. They were fighting to create a republic built on freedom. And if they had a coup at that critical moment, we would get a very different country. Similarly, Lincoln reminded the nation what was at stake in his struggle with great moral clarity. I'll give you one line from the Gettysburg Address. "The war was being fought," he said, "so that the nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth." I love this quote because it ultimately gets at the stakes of the war, right? We had a country based on freedom. And if we let it happen, the nation would be divided and potentially destroyed in the 1860s. After World War II, the nation experienced another new birth of freedom, right? And it mattered in the struggle for civil rights that one side had a moral claim. Harry Truman desegregated the military in part because he was disgusted by how some black soldiers were treated after they got back from the war. You know, one of the most interesting books I've read on the civil rights movement is one I'd recommend. It's called The Race Beat. It's about how journalists started to cover the civil rights movement, national major news outlets. And what happened is interesting, is when the New York Times and other places, the Wall Street Journal as well, started covering what life was like under Jim Crow, millions of Americans said, we can't tolerate this anymore. It changed the conversation. It didn't end the conversation. It took more than a decade after that for a lot of the civil rights legislation to be enacted. But it changed the conversation. It mattered that one side had a moral claim. And this is where LBJ played a political role as well. The short way to say it is he marshaled public opinion, he tempered passions, and he drove legislation through Congress. But that legislation was important for a lot of reasons. One, it changed law. But two, it also gave Americans a vehicle in which to get behind. So if you didn't like the way you didn't like the existence of Jim Crow, the passage of legislation, the existence of leadership gave you something to stand behind, right? It gave a larger moral purpose to people who actually wanted to effect positive change. So the common thread I see running through our history is leaders who inspired our people by identifying a greater purpose that nearly all of us can agree is befitting a great nation. This doesn't mean that finding such a purpose will take away all the difficult moments that we will face. Rather, my argument is that finding a greater purpose is what provides you with a path to navigate the obstacles any great endeavor requires. Consider a more contemporary example, the Cold War. Here's a conflict that pitted the Soviet Union against the United States and other free states. And that conflict spawned more than one counter movement here in the United States that was aimed at getting us to make compromises with the Soviets, right? We could debate today whether the nation was united on how it should respond or how it should lead in the world given the Soviet threat. But I'll argue that it mattered a great deal to the struggle from Truman to Eisenhower, Kennedy, through Reagan and George H.W. Bush, that our president was seen as a leader of the free world. Much like the civil rights movement, one side had a strong moral claim. There wasn't a moral equivalence between the United States and the Soviet Union, to put it in a short way. Now, navigating the politics of the Cold War was extremely difficult. It required a light touch and a deft hand. In my view, one of the underappreciated masters of understanding a larger moral purpose by guiding the nation with a light touch was President George H.W. Bush. He presided over the collapse of the Soviet Union. But here's one thing that a lot of people don't remember or missed at the time. He did so without spending his time moralizing or taking a victory lap. He didn't say, hey, look how much better we are than these guys. Now, why does that matter? I think that approach made it more likely that small d Democrats could emerge in places where communism once ruled without unleashing a backlash against his ideas, without fueling that idea. Instead of pointing backwards and saying, see how screwed up you've been for so long, he stayed focused on producing results. Didn't want to take credit, he was interested in results. In fact, I'd say he sought to inspire rather than moralize, to push towards results rather than to seek credit. And there was great unity and inspiration. I started this talk by asking, how did we achieve national unity in the wake of 9/11? In the Presidential Museum in Dallas, there's a film covering the immediate period after 9/11. We call it the 10-day film. It's from 9/11 to 9/20. That film covers several speeches that I think are critical to understanding this period in history. One of the speeches is the speech that President Bush gave from the Oval Office on the night of 9/11. If you remember, he took great pains to come back to Washington. He wanted to speak to the nation from the Oval Office. That speech is important because he basically did one thing with the speech. He said, we were attacked today. There were other words in there, but acknowledging the attack. Now, it seems like a small thing, but step one in leadership is to acknowledge that you know there's a problem, right? That would be a pretty big problem if your leader didn't understand the enormity of the problem. The next speech in the film that I want to point out is he went to the Islamic Center of Washington. I think this is an absolutely critical speech. It's hard to see now, but at the time the country could have turned on itself. Right? This is a very high-stress time in our country. The passions of the people were inflamed, and unless those passions were tempered, we could have directed sort of invective at Americans who happen to be adherents to Islamic faith. You know, we once interred Japanese Americans. After 9/11, we very easily could have unfairly persecuted Muslims. The president's speech signaled to the country that we would respond to the attacks, but that we would not indiscriminately attack adherents to one of the world's great religions, tempering the passion. And by the way, because the response was seen as valid, similarly the point I just made about civil rights, the president left little room to those who would act irresponsibly. If the president had failed to lead, if we had a Congress like we had in the Articles of Confederation, you could imagine that every that there would be a lot of people that would pop up with a solution that may or may not be what I would call a responsible solution. The next speech is the one that President Bush gave from the National Cathedral. This is an important speech because I think it helped the country mourn. You know, the moment was so searing, and I'm a little close to it. My office was destroyed on 9/11. That the country needed that emotional outlet to say, we're going to take a moment to bury our dead. But the one that I like to point out the most, because I think it's a critical speech, is the impromptu speech he gave at Ground Zero. It's come to be known as the Bullhorn speech. I don't know if anyone in this room has seen the National Geographic special on President Bush visiting Ground Zero after 9/11, but in it, he talks about what it was like to show up there. And he rolls in. On the way in is lined by firemen and police officers who are pulled off the pit to welcome him. And the way he describes it is they are taunting him. And they're saying, do you understand what happened here? And these are guys who had spent days digging through the rubble, in many cases looking for their friends that were missing. And they wanted to know the President of the United States would do something about it. So if you ever watch a tape of him visiting Ground Zero, you'll see he at first is thanking them for their work and trying to comfort them. And then he realizes the moment is different than that. So he decides he has to give a speech. It was not planned. The way Karl Rove tells it is Karl went looking for a platform for the president to speak, and he got a couple of firemen to jump up and down on a broken fire truck to make sure it was stable enough for the president to get up on. Turns out it was, and he told two of them to stay there for a minute. Someone would be there to join him in a minute, and one of them hopped off the back of the truck and had a history, but the other is Bob Beckworth, the fireman who saw a hand, reached down, pulled it up, and realized he just helped the President of the United States onto the fire truck. And he went to hop off, and of course President Bush grabbed a hold of him and said, "You're not going anywhere." Didn't have a microphone, so someone grabbed him a bullhorn, and it turns out the bullhorn was from a Con Ed worker who had been using it all day to direct traffic, so the batteries were pretty much dead, so the crowd couldn't hear him. Someone yells out to him, "George, we can't hear you." And I like to point out that if you watch the tape, that's actually what they say, "George, we can't hear you." And I don't know if you've ever had a chance to meet a president, but to me it's shocking to hear anyone call him by his first name, even when it's Laura. But here, people who hadn't met him, the point is, this is a very intimate moment. So, you know the speech that he delivers. He gets on the bullhorn, and it happens to catch, and he says, "Well, I can hear you. The world hears you, and pretty soon the people who knock these buildings down will hear from all of us." There's a deeper meaning to that, and they caught it immediately. So this guy's going to do something about this, right? I think it was critical to bring the country together. The final speech in this film is the one that stopped the hockey game, the joint session speech. The president used that speech to lay out a broader plan for what he was going to do. So great, he acknowledged the problem, he tempered passions, he helped the country mourn, he indicated we're going to do something substantive. Now it was time to say what he was going to do. So he gets in front of Congress and he lays it out. But the speech is really interesting, and I encourage you to go back and look at the text of these different speeches, because they're interesting to read, at least if you're a history junkie like me. The president indicated that spreading freedom would be a driving force of his administration. And I'll argue that there's a moral component to that. The other side is offering severe oppression of women in Afghanistan, and we're offering freedom, right? In fact, that was going to be the driving idea, spreading freedom, to counter a movement that had been oppressing or seeking to oppress hundreds of millions of people around the globe. It's not a small number of people. One thing the president said that night, though, also aimed at tempering passions. He said, "We are in a fight for our principles, and our first responsibilities is to live by them." He went on to say, "No one should be singled out for unfair treatment or unkind words because of their rhetoric, their ethnic background or religious faith." Right? We're going to go to war, but we're going to do so on high moral footing. Taken together, I think these moments demonstrated to the American people that the president understood the problem, was going to do something about it in a vigorous and sustained way. But at best, I think that this is a truncated version for why the country came together, why we found national unity in that particular moment of crisis. I think any comprehensive list of what brought us together would have to start with the core values, common decency, and fundamental belief in human freedom shared by the American people. But in terms of leadership, I would add to the list something else that is too often discounted or overlooked entirely. And that's presidential level policies and leadership intended to inspire Americans to dedicate part of their lives to serving a greater purpose that came before 9/11. Remember where we were in December of 2000. We had 30-plus days of a disputed election. We were a divided country. Red America, blue America, 50-50 split. Tough court case. So how is it that 10 months later Americans are so quick to come together in this moment of crisis? How is that possible? It's my contention that one place that we ought to look for an answer to that question is the policies and public comments from the new president. In a speech he delivered in Austin right after the election dispute was resolved, George W. Bush called for national unity. It's a fascinating speech, by the way. I encourage you to read it. One of Jefferson's famous speeches was his inaugural, when he said, also a very tough disputed election, where he said, we're all Americans. Now the election's over. It's now time to come together. I'd compare that speech to President Bush's speech in December 2000, to a similar call. But his call came with a very humble message. I'll read you a quote from the speech. It is, "Whether you voted for me or not, I will do my best to serve your interests, and I will work to earn your respect." So here's a guy who just won the presidential election, and the first thing he turns around and says to you is, now I'm going to start working on earning your respect. Not that he hadn't been doing that before, but that was his going mode after the dispute was worked out. During the campaign, he called for giving purpose to our prosperity. That's a little catchy phrase, but I encourage you to think about what that means for a minute, right? We were a prosperous nation, but what are we going to do with it? Is it enough just to be wealthy? What's the purpose? And in his first inaugural address, he called on Americans to be citizens, not spectators, by which he meant get engaged. He was calling Americans to think about how to use our national success to serve a greater end. And I'd say he's leading by example. You point to the speech in December I just mentioned. In the months that followed, the new president pursued education reform and said his efforts would be guided by the belief that no child should be left behind. Okay, so that's the name of the law, right? So because it's the name of the law and bounded around so much, I think we forget the meaning of the words. What does it mean? Leave no child left behind. That means we were going to teach every child. That's the standard in which we were going to try to set in passing the law. He also began implementing a policy that became known as the Faith-Based and Community Initiative. These were policies that appealed to what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature. The policies had a moral component to them that might inspire you to join a greater cause or a great challenge. One of the underlying messages here is so subtle that you might have made a mental turn and not have even realized it. Remember, we are talking about how we achieve national unity. With his focus and approach on education policy, the president was articulating national goals the vast majority of Americans could agree with, that every child should get a legit education. Many Americans, including more than a few who didn't vote for him, such as Senator Ted Kennedy, were willing to follow the president's lead because they believed in the principles that he seemed to be following. So when you have a larger principle, somebody who doesn't agree with you will follow you if you're following that principle. I'd say by seeking a system that teaches every child, he was uniting the country behind a common purpose. Similarly, the Faith-Based and Community Initiative, the new administration in 2001 was seeking to implement good policy that also happened to be laying the groundwork for national unity. The initiative, of course, generated plenty of flack in Washington. I don't know if you remember the different comments being made at the time. But outside the Beltway, the program was a unifying force for many that helped pull faith-based and community groups together and into the public square. Why is that important, by the way? If you look at the faith-based and community-based groups, they're some of the most effective groups confronting some of the toughest social problems that we have. So you're taking them and you're putting them with government officials and others who are interested in solving these problems and saying, here's a group who actually is solving the problems or making great headway. You have money and resources, and this is you say this is what you want you to do. You're putting the two together. I'd say that's a definition of unity there. But these are really tough problems to solve, by the way, too. We're talking about substance abuse, crime, and that great killer of communities, the loss of faith and hope, right? When you don't believe that people believe in you, it's hard to stay focused on living a good life, right? And there's a lot of quotes that I could pull out from George W. Bush talking about why he would meet with prisoners and why he would talk to them. I don't know if you remember, there's a somewhat famous photo of him in a prison singing Amazing Grace. I asked him during the museum project why he did that. And his comment back was it was important to send a signal to them that we had not lost faith in them. Someone believes in them. This personal hands-on touch for people in a tough spot, I'd say, is a hallmark of President Bush's leadership. But it's an important component of it. Whether you agree with his policies or not, I think it's important to look at and why it might be important. Now, to give you a better sense of what I mean, I think it's always important to bring slides, bring images for people to take a look at. I want to show you a couple of photographs of what I mean. And I'll interpret them as we go. And I'll skip through about 10 of them, but we'll go quickly on them. We'll start with this guy. This is that Ground Zero speech I mentioned a minute ago. These were guys who, by President Bush's own account, were taunting him when he walked in. But at the end of it, they were making a strong personal connection to him. This photo, the next one, are ones you may not remember, but they are also right after 9/11. This is at the Javits Center in New York, meeting with families of people family members of those who were killed on 9/11. The reason you may not remember seeing many of these photographs is the president didn't want these moments to become photo ops. He wanted to give somebody a moment to meet with the president. This one you might remember. The woman in the chair is Arlene Howard. She lost her son George in the attacks. The reason you might remember it is she gave him the badge that President Bush is holding here. This is the joint session speech. And he says, a lot of us have memories that we'll carry with us for the rest of our lives. He reached into his pocket and said, I carry this to remind me. I always thought that was an interesting approach because this is a very personal artifact. Police officer's badge is something that was son of a cop, so maybe I put too much meaning on a badge, but my grandfather was a police officer in New York and my father was a police officer. A badge is a very personal thing. My grandfather, years after retiring, could tell you his badge number. This one you might remember. This one surprised a lot of people, including members of his family. He was going to celebrate Thanksgiving dinner here at Crawford and made a surprise trip to Iraq, to Baghdad. So much so that Mrs. Bush called the Secret Service and asked if they knew where President Bush was. She meant 41, George H.W. Bush. They thought she meant George W. Bush. They said, our records are showing him at the residence, and she thought to herself, the Secret Service's agents at the gate of the ranch didn't know that President Bush had left the ranch and was en route to Iraq. That's how tight security was on this. But it was important for President Bush to go there. And by the way, none of the troops obviously knew that he was there. If you talk to some of the troops that were there, the second he walked out, just pandemonium broke loose. It was important that he showed up personally to thank people that were making a sacrifice and to say thanks at Thanksgiving. This one you may not have seen before. This kind of personal touch was important to him. This one I wanted to pull out. It's a tough photo for me to look at, but because I have a lot of family members who've served in the Marines, and some of which who faced some pretty tough spots. But I wanted to pull this photograph out because clearly it's a man engaged with someone in a tough spot. This is the photograph I'm going to end on. And it has to do with something that we haven't talked about at all. The moment that President Bush went to Yankee Stadium to throw out the first pitch for one of the World Series games in 2001. You know, by the time terrorists attacked the United States with jetliners, all of these things I just mentioned, from faith-based initiative to the education policies to the speeches to some of the intimate moments that he had with Americans. Americans had come to see George W. Bush as a president who was willing to join with them in taking on the evils they faced in their own lives. In other words, by the time the crisis came and long afterward, Americans were willing to listen to him, even as we saw to stop a professional hockey game. May not agree with him, may not like what he had to say, but they said, you know what? He sets a moral principle that's worth achieving, so let's see if he's actually going to lead us there, and to listen to him. I'm ending on this photo for two reasons. First, it's an example of how a simple act can carry a larger message. In this case, by showing up at the national sporting event when nerves were still raw, and I was living in New York at the time, and a lot of us were convinced that when the World Series came to New York that something bad was going to happen. In fact, I was on the Brooklyn Promenade when the Trade Center was attacked. I don't know if you know New York that well, but the Brooklyn Promenade oversees Lower Manhattan. You can see the Trade Center and the Brooklyn Bridge and the Statue of Liberty, and you could see the second jetliner come through and smack into the building. And I was standing there, and we could see people jumping from the buildings. And after the second plane was hit, there was a woman next to me, slapped me on the chest and yelled, "We're under attack," and ran down the main street. The guy to my right said, "Osama bin Laden always did want those towers." And a thought that ran through my head and a lot of other people's heads as we looked at the Brooklyn Bridge and said, that's not going to be here in 2 months. Well, 2 months later, it was still there, and we have the World Series coming to New York. So it seemed likely to be fearful. So when the President of the United States shows up and stands in the middle of the stadium and throws out the first pitch, what is he saying? He's saying, we're not going to live in fear. In fact, we're going to lean forward, right? Pulling us together. The second reason I'm ending on this photo is that President Bush is standing on the mound and about to throw the pitch. You know, life will pitch us the ball. How we respond and whether we look to lead to a larger moral purpose is up to us.